Hey there, 7th grade history students. Welcome back. Today's explainer is a real hands-on workshop. We aren't just going to sit back and listen to a story today. We're actually going to roll up our sleeves and analyze some historical evidence about colonization together. Just like real historians do. Okay, let's dive into this.
So, here is our game plan for today. First, exploring colonial settlement. Then, comparing historical evidence. After that, the misconception check. Then, we've got test your knowledge and finally, a quick lesson recap. Let's get to it. Section 1. Exploring colonial settlement. To truly wrap our heads around the English arrival in North America, we've got to grasp just how much of a struggle those early years really were. Back in late 1606, the Virginia Company sent an expedition all the way across the Atlantic. By April and May of 1607, a group of 105 men stepped off their ship to establish a settlement on an island up a river. They named it Jamestown, and let me tell you, it was unbelievably grueling. By the winter of 1609, the colony endured what became famously known as the Starving Time. This was a completely brutal, terrifying period. Hundreds more had arrived by this point, but because of a massive lack of preparation and just incredibly harsh conditions, the population absolutely plummeted. Only a few dozen colonists survived that freezing winter, desperately eating literally anything they could find. We're talking roots, bark, and even shoe leather. But they persevered. A decade later, by 1619, they had found enough stability to actually establish the General Assembly. This was massive. It was the very first representative governing body of its kind in North America, laying the early groundwork for the democratic systems we know today.
But you might be wondering, why on earth did they pick this specific spot in the first place? Well, the Virginia Company had some very specific and, frankly, kind of misguided goals. First off, they were completely obsessed with finding gold. They literally expected to just scoop it right off the ground. Because of that, they wasted precious time searching for riches in a place where there simply wasn't any. Second, they were desperately hoping to find a direct water route, a Northwest Passage, straight through the continent to Asia for trade. And third, on a more strategic level, they wanted to settle far enough inland, up the river, so they wouldn't be sitting ducks in the firing range of hostile Spanish ships that were heavily patrolling the Atlantic coast.
And this brilliantly illustrates a much larger point about early America. European settlement patterns, whether we're talking about New England, the Middle Atlantic, or the southern colonies, were totally dictated by vital geographic conditions. Where you lived depended on absolute necessities. You needed access to deep harbors, right? Because without them, trade ships couldn't reach you with essential supplies. You needed natural protection from enemies, and most importantly, you needed arable land, adequate rainfall, and a long enough growing season. Because if you can't grow crops, you don't eat. It was a simple, harsh reality. You either adapt to your environment or you don't make it.
Section 2. Comparing historical evidence.
Now, when we compare the evidence, a really stark contrast emerges. We just established that general colonial success relied on ideal geography, right? Clear water, natural harbors, adapting to the local environment. But Jamestown's reality? It was the exact opposite. They deliberately chose to build their settlement on a swampy location, which, no surprise, quickly gave rise to mosquito-borne epidemics and rampant disease. And to make matters worse, among the initial colonists were 35 wealthy gentlemen. These were aristocrats who flat out refused to demean themselves with agricultural labor. Just imagine that for a second. You're in a life-or-death survival situation, surrounded by a swamp, and you refuse to plant a single seed because you think farming is beneath you. So a swamp plus a refusal to farm equals a recipe for absolute disaster, leading directly to those severe deadly food shortages we talked about earlier. We also have to compare the changing perspectives of the people actually living through all this. Initially, the settlers and the Native Confederation led by Chief Powhatan were pretty hostile to one another. But soon, the English desperately had to rely on Chief Powhatan to trade for food. Honestly, that fragile trade relationship is arguably the only thing that saved the English from total collapse during their first harsh winter. However, as time marched on, that dynamic shifted drastically. From the Native American perspective, the early desperation of the settlers turned into continuous, aggressive encroachment onto their ancestral lands. This mounting tension over territory just wasn't sustainable. The frustration eventually boiled over, culminating in 1622 when coordinated attacks on various colonial plantations left 300 English dead, fundamentally and violently changing their relationship forever.
Section 3. The misconception checked. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this powerful quote from the poet Walt Whitman, which is featured in the National Archives. He wrote this all the way back in 1883. What's absolutely crucial here is that Whitman points out a massive historical blind spot. A major misconception when studying colonization is thinking that early America was exclusively shaped by the British arriving on the East Coast. Whitman boldly calls this a very great mistake. And you know what? The historical evidence absolutely backs him up on that.
Let's just prove that misconception wrong right now. Vast portions of what is now the United States were actually part of the Spanish Empire long before the English ever arrived. Look at this. In 1598, nearly a full decade before a single English boot touched the ground in Jamestown, the Spanish founded the colony of New Mexico. They wanted to Christianize the region and extract its riches, which brought decades of harsh rule and persecution. This eventually sparked the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, a massive, successful uprising that actually drove the Spanish south to El Paso. It wasn't until 1692 that Don Diego de Vargas began his heavily armed reconquest of Santa Fe.
And we definitely need to provide some vital context for the Native communities involved in that history. The New World wasn't empty, and it certainly wasn't new. It had thriving communities that had lived there for thousands of years. When the Spanish arrived in the Southwest, they didn't just find empty deserts. They encountered people living in incredible, complex, multi-storied apartment-like dwellings that were absolute architectural marvels. The Spanish used the word pueblos, which is their word for towns, to describe both the ingenious native inhabitants of the region themselves and the sprawling, magnificent dwellings they had built over generations.
Section 4. Test your knowledge. Let's see what you remember.
All right, it's time to actively apply what you've just learned. Here is your question for today. Based on the historical evidence we examined earlier, what strict rule did John Smith implement to ensure Jamestown's survival during those severe food shortages? I'll give you a quick hint. Think back to those well-heeled aristocratic gentlemen whose absolute refusal to work put the entire settlement in a very precarious position. What did Smith do to force them to help? Take a second and think about your answer.
Got it? The answer is, he who does not work will not eat. John Smith was actually elected president of the local council in September of 1608. Realizing that the settlement would completely collapse if the wealthy gentleman didn't finally pitch in, he laid down the law with strict authority. This simple, uncompromising rule compelled absolutely everyone to perform physical labor, and it worked. It successfully stabilized the food supply and saved the colony from ruin for a time.
Section 5. Lesson Recap. So the crucial point is this. We can distill our entire workshop today into 3 main takeaways. First, the geographic environment, things like access to clear water, deep harbors, and arable land, absolutely dictated colonial survival. You literally had to adapt to nature. Second, the English at Jamestown struggled immensely because they actively ignored those geographic rules. They built on a disease-ridden swamp and faced starvation when colonists arrogantly refused to farm. And third, early America wasn't just British. Spanish settlements in places like New Mexico predated the English colonies by years, deeply interacting with native Pueblo communities that had thrived there for millennia.
I want to leave you with a final thought to consider as we wrap up today. We just saw how swamps, harbors, and rainfall determined life or death back in the 1600s. But look around you today. How does the physical geography of where you live continue to shape your life and your community right now? Think about how the rivers, the mountains, or even just the weather in your town impact the way you live every single day. Keep that curiosity alive, and we'll see you next time as we continue our journey through history.